Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. The twin suns hung low over the jagged horizon of Etris IV, casting long, blood-red shadows across the wasteland. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving settlement, now reduced to rubble and ash. Among the debris, a figure stumbled, Kira, her violet skin smeared with dust, clutching the fragile hand of her daughter, Lena. The little girl's pale eyes were dull, her steps faltering with every breath. Kira's heart ached. She could feel Lena's life slipping away like grains of sand through her fingers. They hadn't eaten in days. The emergency rations from their destroyed colony were gone, and every attempt to find food had ended in failure. The raiders had taken everything, lives, homes, and hope. Kira's legs buckled, and she collapsed to her knees. Lena whimpered, her tiny frame trembling. Can't let her die. The thought echoed in Kira's mind, a desperate mantra. But as her vision blurred, the weight of reality crushed her spirit. Then, a shadow fell over them. Kira's instincts flared. She pulled Lena close, her sharp eyes narrowing as she scanned the figure approaching through the dust. A human, tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face partially hidden beneath a helmet. His rifle was slung casually over his back, but Kira didn't trust the relaxed posture. Humans brought nothing but death and destruction. It was their wars that had drawn the raiders here in the first place. The man stopped a few feet away, raising his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Easy there," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "I'm not here to hurt you," Kira hissed, baring her teeth. "Stay back, human." But the man didn't move away. Instead, he reached into his pack slowly, pulling out a ration bar. He tossed it gently toward them, letting it land in the dirt between them. Kira's eyes darted from the food to the man and back again. Could be poisoned. A trick. But Lena let out a faint, pitiful whine, and Kira's resolve cracked. She snatched the bar, tearing it open with trembling fingers. She broke it in half, pressing the larger piece into Lena's hands. The child devoured it greedily, her small body shuddering with each bite. Kira watched, her throat tight. When Lena finished, her breathing steadied slightly, and she curled into Kira's side, exhaustion overtaking her. The man finally spoke again. "She needs more than that. Shelter, water, medicine." He paused, studying Kira. "I've got supplies. You can come with me, or stay here and—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Kira's pride screamed at her to refuse. But Lena's fragile form was a weight in her arms, heavier than any stubbornness she could muster. She stood slowly, her eyes never leaving the man's. "If you try anything," she warned, her voice low and dangerous, "I will kill you." The man's lips twitched in a half-smile. "Fair enough. Name's Ethan." Kira didn't offer her name in return. As they trudged through the wasteland toward Ethan's makeshift shelter, a half-buried freighter hull, Kira's mind raced. She didn't trust him. She couldn't. But for Lena's sake, she would endure this, for now. The shelter Ethan had led them to was little more than a half-buried freighter hull, its metal walls rusted and battered by years of neglect. Yet, inside, it provided a sense of safety Kira hadn't felt in days. The air was still and musty, the dim light from an old generator casting long shadows against the walls. Lena, exhausted, immediately collapsed onto a makeshift bed of rags, curling up with a soft sigh. Kira kept her watchful gaze on Ethan as he moved around the shelter, unpacking what looked like a collection of scavenged supplies. Ethan didn't seem to notice her scrutiny as he efficiently set to work, laying out a med kit and grabbing what looked like more ration bars from his pack. His movements were smooth, practiced, a sharp contrast to the disarray of the shelter. Kira's instincts screamed at her to remain on guard. Trusting a human was dangerous. They were all the same, weren't they? Warmongers, opportunists, cold-hearted. She had seen enough of their atrocities in the war, enough to make her blood boil at the mere thought of them. Her species had fought, bled, and died for every inch of peace they'd ever earned. And yet, there they were, humans scattered across the galaxy, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. "Is she okay?" Ethan's voice broke her out of her reverie. He was standing at her side, holding out a ration bar and a water pouch. His expression was earnest, his brow furrowed with concern. Kira stiffened. She'll survive. For now. He nodded but didn't push further. Good. I've got more food coming in, but you'll need to rest as well. I can keep watch. Kira didn't answer. She wanted to refuse, to insist she was fine. But the cold weight of exhaustion was beginning to settle in her bones, and her body was betraying her. She glanced over at Lena, whose breathing had slowed and steadied. At least her daughter was safe for the moment. Reluctantly, Kira lowered herself to the ground, sitting beside Lena and wrapping her arms protectively around the child. Ethan moved quietly around the shelter, setting up a small cooking unit and rummaging through his gear. The silence between them stretched, thick with the unspoken tension that hung in the air. Kira couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was playing a game, one she wasn't yet ready to understand. It wasn't just food he had offered them. It was protection. And that was something Kira wasn't sure she could accept. Not from a human. When Ethan finally spoke again, his voice was softer, almost hesitant. You don't trust me, do you? Kira tensed. The question was blunt, direct. But it wasn't a surprise. She had done nothing to hide her wariness. No, she replied, her voice cold. Why would I trust a human? Ethan let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of her response had drained him. I get it. I know what my people have done to yours. I've seen it. I'm not proud of it. Kira's eyes narrowed. You've seen it? What, you think that makes you different? You're all the same. Ethan's gaze hardened, but there was no anger in it, just a quiet understanding. No, not all of us. I didn't come here to save you for some humanity nonsense. I came because I've seen too many people die for no reason. He paused, looking away for a moment as if lost in his own memories. War isn't what you think it is. It's not noble. It's not clean. People like me get out of it and we're left to pick up the pieces. Kira was quiet, her sharp gaze never leaving him. She had no words for what he had said. He sounded sincere, but sincerity wasn't enough to erase centuries of distrust. The scars ran too deep. Ethan continued, his tone growing more measured. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm just trying to help. And right now, you need help. The air between them was thick with unspoken emotions, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if sensing her resistance was wavering, Ethan shifted, reaching for a small med kit. He gestured toward Lena. You mind if I take a look at her? I have some basic treatments that might speed up her recovery. Kira hesitated, her protective instincts flaring. But looking at Lena, who lay motionless, pale and fragile in her makeshift bed, Kira finally nodded. Do what you must. Ethan moved quickly, carefully checking Lena's vitals. Kira hovered nearby, her body coiled, ready to spring into action at the first sign of danger. But Ethan handled the task with surprising gentleness. He cleaned the child's skin with a damp cloth, applied some kind of ointment to her arms, and set up a makeshift foredrip for hydration. All the while, he never made a move that could be interpreted as threatening. It was something Kira hadn't expected. Her people had fought tooth and nail for every scrap of survival, but this human was trying to save her daughter. The realization slowly settled over her, like a weight on her chest. When Ethan finished, he stood back, wiping his hands on a cloth. She's going to be okay. Just needs rest and more fluids. Kira didn't know what to say. She just nodded, her throat tight. She had expected him to leave, to demand something in return. But Ethan simply returned to his corner of the shelter, settling into his own bedroll without another word. The silence that followed was a new one, quieter, more uncertain. And for the first time, Kira wasn't sure what to think of the man who had saved them. The days passed in a fragile, uneasy quiet. Kira couldn't quite shake the tension that clung to the air between her and Ethan. She had never fully trusted anyone, let alone a human, but her desperation had forced her to accept his help, if only temporarily. Lena's condition improved slowly, thanks to the treatments and food Ethan provided. But Kira knew this fragile peace couldn't last forever. As the third night fell, the wind carried a distant, ominous rumble across the desolate wasteland. Kira stiffened, her senses on high alert. She had been trained to listen to the land, to read the signs in the shifting air. There was something wrong, something dangerous. She stood abruptly, causing Ethan to glance up from where he had been tinkering with some salvage. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "The raiders are near," Kira said, her tone sharp. She didn't need to elaborate. The raiders who had attacked her colony were ruthless. They hadn't left the area, they were still hunting survivors. And if they found them here, there would be no mercy. Ethan frowned, looking out toward the horizon, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung across his back. "How far?" "Not far," Kira replied. "They move fast. They won't wait for us to be ready." Ethan's eyes hardened. "Then we don't have time to waste. Get your daughter. We need to move." Kira's heart clenched. She had hoped they could rest, hopelessly so. But she couldn't afford that luxury now. She moved swiftly to Lena's side, gently shaking her awake. The little girl stirred with a soft whimper, her big eyes wide and frightened. "Lena, listen to me. We have to go. Stay close to me, all right?" Lena nodded, clutching her mother's hand. Kira scooped her up, holding her protectively against her chest as she looked to Ethan. "Where?" "There's a military bunker not far from here," Ethan said, already pulling his pack together. "It'll give us some cover, at least for a while." Kira didn't question his words. She just followed him. Her mind focused on the sound of distant engines growing louder with each passing moment. The raiders were closing in. As they trekked through the dust, the adrenaline surged through Kira's veins, sharpening her senses. She could hear the engines now, roaring to life in the distance, and the voices of the raiders calling to each other, gruff, guttural, and predatory. The air was thick with the smell of oil and burnt fuel, a scent Kira had come to associate with violence. Ethan led the way with swift, confident steps. He knew this land better than Kira had expected, weaving through the ruins and debris with ease. She followed, her thoughts racing. Was he guiding them toward safety or into a trap? As they neared the bunker, Kira's mind sharpened, her instincts on high alert. She had no doubt that the raiders would be ruthless once they discovered their trail. They would stop at nothing to claim their prize. They reached the bunker just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. Ethan pushed open the rusted hatch, revealing the dark interior. Kira hesitated, her fingers tightening around Lena's small hand. "Get inside." Quickly, Ethan urged, his voice low and urgent. Kira stepped inside, keeping her daughter close. She immediately crouched by the entrance, peering out into the darkness, her senses attuned to the sound of the approaching raiders. Ethan closed the hatch behind them, securing it with a soft, deliberate click. The bunker was dimly lit by a few emergency lights, but it felt safe for now. Kira took a deep breath, her shoulders tense as she glanced around. The space was mostly empty, save for some old crates and discarded equipment. It was a relic of the old wars, something abandoned long ago. Lena sank to the floor, exhausted from the journey. Kira knelt beside her, running a hand over her daughter's hair in an attempt to soothe her. She knew they couldn't stay here long. Soon, the raiders would be too close, but for now they had a moment of respite. Ethan stood near the far wall, checking his weapon and muttering to himself. Kira watched him carefully, wondering what kind of man he truly was. He had proven himself in small ways, saving her daughter, offering shelter, even protecting them from the dangers outside. But there was still so much she didn't know. And, if she was honest with herself, she didn't fully trust him yet. "The raiders will find us," Kira said quietly, her eyes scanning the entrance. "They're close." Ethan didn't look at her, but his voice was steady. "I know. We'll fight back." Kira's heart raced. She had no intention of letting her daughter be caught in the crossfire again. She had survived countless battles, but this wasn't her fight alone. She was responsible for Lena's safety now. "Do you have a plan?" she asked, her voice sharp. Ethan nodded, his expression grim. We can't just run. We'll set up a trap. I'll use some of the old gear here to rig an ambush. If we're lucky, we can take them down before they know what hit them. Kira studied him, her eyes narrowing. And if we're not lucky? Then we fight, Ethan said, his voice cold, devoid of hesitation. Kira felt a flicker of respect for him. He wasn't like the humans she had known. He wasn't a soldier driven by orders or cold duty. He was a man trying to survive. And that she could understand. As they worked quickly to prepare the bunker, Kira couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision they had made. To trust Ethan, even this much, had been a risk. But now, as the sound of Raider engines grew louder, it was a risk that might just pay off. Lena, exhausted but still clutching her mother's side, looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. Kira ran her fingers through her daughter's hair, a silent promise to protect her no matter the cost. The sound of engines grew louder, reverberating through the metal walls of the bunker. Kira's pulse quickened as she looked over at Ethan, who was busy rigging what appeared to be makeshift explosives out of old equipment. His face was set, his eyes focused, but there was a tension in his movements, an undercurrent of urgency that matched Kira's own rising anxiety. Ethan glanced at Kira. Get ready, he said quietly. It's going to be a fight. Kira nodded, her hand instinctively going to the blade strapped to her side. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The weapons in the bunker were either too old or too unstable to be of much use, so she had to rely on her own skills. And that was something she trusted, something she had honed over years of war, of survival. Lena, asleep on the floor by Kira's side, stirred but didn't wake. She was exhausted, worn down by days of hunger and fear. Kira's heart tightened, and for a moment, she couldn't help but wonder if her daughter would ever know peace, if she would ever be free of this endless cycle of survival. Lena, Kira whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Stay down. Stay quiet. We'll get through this. Lena blinked up at her, her eyes wide with confusion, but she didn't speak. The little girl simply nodded and clutched her mother's arm. Kira could feel her daughter's warmth, and it reminded her of everything she was fighting for. The bunker was dark except for the dim emergency lights, but the sound of the Raider engines was unmistakable now. They were close, too close. Kira moved to the entrance, crouching low, and peered through a crack in the old door, her eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, the headlights of the Raider vehicles illuminated the barren landscape. There were several of them, armored and heavily armed, moving with the precision of hunters closing in on their prey. Ethan joined her, his expression grim as he surveyed the enemy's approach. He didn't speak, but Kira could see the determination in his eyes. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about fighting back. We have to move fast, Kira muttered, glancing over at the trap Ethan had set up. It wasn't elaborate, but it would have to do. The bunker had a narrow entrance, perfect for funneling the Raiders into a kill zone. The explosives Ethan had rigged would provide a distraction, but it was only a temporary one. If they didn't act quickly, the Raiders would storm the place and overwhelm them. Ethan nodded. I'll trigger the explosives when they get close. That should give us some time. Kira looked at him, her gaze calculating. What happens after that? We run, Ethan said flatly. We don't stay and fight. We take the opening and we move. Kira hesitated. She didn't like the sound of that. Running, fleeing was something she had done before. It was something she had always done when her back was against the wall. But this time it felt different. This time they were in a position to fight back, to take control. But then she looked at Lena again, her daughter, the reason Kira had to keep going, no matter the cost. She couldn't risk losing her now. Before Kira could speak again, the ground beneath them trembled as the Raiders' engines roared to life. They were here. Ethan's eyes met hers, and he nodded. It was time. Get ready, he said again, more firmly this time. Kira tightened her grip on her blade, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the anticipation in the air, the charged energy of imminent battle. The Raiders were coming, and this time she would make them regret it. The first Raider vehicle appeared, kicking up a cloud of dust as it barreled toward the bunker. Kira held her breath, her body poised for action. The moment they were close enough, Ethan would trigger the explosives. But she wasn't going to wait idly by. She would fight. She had to. The Raider's vehicle slowed as it approached the entrance of the bunker, its headlights blinding Kira for a moment. She could hear the shouts of the Raiders, their rough voices barking orders, their weapons ready. They were almost upon them. Ethan's hand reached for the detonator. But just as his finger hovered over the trigger, something unexpected happened. A loud crack split the air, and the earth beneath their feet shook violently. Kira stumbled, barely catching herself against the wall of the bunker as the ground quaked. "What the hell?" Ethan growled, his eyes wide with confusion. Kira's heart dropped into her stomach. She knew that sound, the sound of an incoming blast. The Raiders had set a trap of their own. Before she could react, a bright flash of light erupted from behind them, illuminating the entire landscape. The explosion rocked the air, throwing Kira off her feet. The sound of shattering metal and groaning walls filled the air as the shockwave passed over them. She heard a scream, a human scream, cut off by the deafening roar of the explosion. Kira scrambled to her feet, disoriented, her ears ringing. Ethan was already moving, his hand on her arm, pulling her toward the far side of the bunker. "We need to move now," he shouted. Kira didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Lena and ran, her legs burning with each step. The sounds of battle had already begun outside, the harsh crackle of gunfire, the shouts of Raiders cursing as they regrouped. But the bunker wasn't safe anymore. The explosion had alerted every Raider in the area, and now they were all coming for them. They sprinted through the narrow halls of the bunker, Ethan leading the way. Kira's heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Raiders closing in, determined to capture or kill. They weren't going to let anyone escape. The entrance was blocked, debris from the explosion littering the ground. But Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby piece of scrap metal, using it to force open a side door that led into the open desert. The harsh wind hit them as they stumbled outside, but Kira barely registered the cold air. All she could think about was getting Lena to safety. Ethan pushed them forward, his voice urgent. "This way. We can't stop." Kira didn't look back. She couldn't. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, she felt something stir inside her. A flicker of hope. The desert stretched out before them, vast and empty, an unforgiving expanse of jagged rocks and endless dunes. The night had fallen completely now, the stars barely visible through the dust clouds kicked up by the explosion. Kira's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she ran. Lena held tightly in her arms. The heat of the day had given way to a biting cold, and the wind seemed to cut through her bones. But there was no time to think about anything except the threat behind them. Ethan led the way, his pace quick and sure despite the chaos they had just escaped. Kira struggled to keep up, her body still aching from the earlier fight. The shock of the explosion had rattled her more than she cared to admit, but it was Lena's safety that fueled her now. She couldn't let her daughter suffer anymore, not after everything they had been through. The sound of the Raiders' vehicles echoed in the distance, their engines roaring as they hunted them down. The chase had begun, and the time for subtlety had passed. The Raiders were relentless, and their numbers were growing. Kira could only hope the head start they gained by escaping the bunker would be enough to put some distance between them and the enemy. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We need to find cover," he muttered. "There's a ridge up ahead. If we can make it there, we can hide for a while." Kira didn't argue. She knew they couldn't keep running indefinitely. They needed a plan, a chance to regroup, or else they would be sitting ducks. But even as they moved toward the ridge, the sound of the Raiders grew louder. They were getting closer, and the reality of the situation settled heavily on Kira's shoulders. "We'll make it," Ethan said, as if reading her mind. "We're not dead yet." His words didn't make her feel any better. They both knew the odds were stacked against them. The Raiders weren't just after them. They were hunting for anything of value, and they knew that Kira and her daughter, both survivors of a destroyed colony, had something the raiders wanted: knowledge, technology, and the promise of a world to conquer. It made them targets. The ridge was getting closer, but the raiders were gaining. Kira could see their vehicles now, kicking up dust and weaving between rocks in an effort to follow them. She gritted her teeth, her eyes fixed on the ridge ahead. If they could just reach it. A sudden roar cut through the air. One of the raider vehicles had accelerated, trying to overtake them. Kira instinctively pulled Lena closer, her body tensing as she calculated their next move. Ethan stopped in his tracks, turning to face the oncoming vehicle. "Get down!" he barked, pushing Kira and Lena to the ground behind a large boulder. Kira instinctively shielded her daughter with her body, her heart pounding in her chest. The raider vehicle shot past them, too close for comfort, its heavy wheels kicking up dirt and debris. Kira heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire, followed by the sharp crack of a bullet hitting rock. The raiders weren't just chasing them, they were trying to kill them. Ethan's voice was low but urgent. "Stay down. I'll take care of them." Kira's eyes flashed up to meet his, but he was already on the move, disappearing into the shadows. She wanted to stop him, to argue, to protest, to tell him that she needed him. But there was no time. They were on the edge of survival now, and she had to trust him. She had no choice. The sounds of the raider vehicles echoed again, and Kira could feel her pulse racing. She glanced at Lena, who was clinging to her, her small face streaked with dirt and fear. The little girl didn't speak. She didn't need to. They had been through enough. This was no longer just about surviving. This was about protecting each other. Kira's thoughts were interrupted as a series of sharp cracks pierced the air. Gunshots. The raiders were firing at something, and the sound was getting closer. Kira's heart skipped a beat. She needed to act. Without thinking, Kira stood, pulling Lena to her feet. She didn't know where Ethan had gone, but she couldn't wait any longer. The raiders were too close. She had to lead them away, create a diversion, anything to buy them more time. Lena looked up at her mother, her small hand gripping Kira's tightly. "Mom, where's the man? Is he coming back?" Kira forced a smile, even though her insides were twisted with fear. "He's fighting for us. He'll be okay." She didn't know if that was true. She didn't know anything anymore, but it was the only thing she could say. She motioned for Lena to follow her, moving low across the rocks and through the dust. The ridge was in sight, but the raiders were closing in, their vehicles now on the edge of the terrain. Kira's mind raced, trying to think of a way to throw them off their trail. Suddenly, the sharp whine of a vehicle engine cut through the air, and Kira turned just in time to see one of the raiders speeding toward them. He had spotted them. She had to act fast. A burst of gunfire erupted, narrowly missing them as Kira dove behind a large boulder with Lena in tow. Her heart was hammering in her chest as she pulled her daughter closer, shielding her from the storm of bullets that followed. Kira's thoughts were a blur, only instinct driving her now. She reached for the makeshift blaster at her side, hoping it would be enough to hold the raiders off long enough for them to escape. She fired blindly, the energy bolt striking the rocks near the vehicle, sending up a spray of dirt. The raiders didn't seem fazed, they were too focused on capturing them. And then, just as it seemed they were done for, the distant roar of an engine cut through the chaos. Kira's breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was. Ethan. He had circled around, using the terrain to his advantage. The raider vehicle was now caught in a crossfire, the heavy thrum of gunfire ricocheting off rocks as Ethan attacked from behind. Kira didn't hesitate. She grabbed Lena's hand and sprinted toward the ridge. She had to get them to safety. They had to stay alive. As they reached the ridge, Kira heard the sound of the raider vehicle collapsing, followed by the echoing roar of victory. Ethan had done it. He had given them a chance. But the fight wasn't over. The night was still long, and the raiders wouldn't stop coming. The wind howled through the jagged rocks as Kira and Lena reached the top of the ridge, breathless and trembling from the sprint. The night sky was a canvas of stars, but the danger was far from over. The distant sounds of gunfire and explosions echoed in the still desert air. Ethan had bought them some time, but that wouldn't last. The raiders would regroup and they would come for them again. Kira looked around, trying to find a way to gain the upper hand. The ridge was rocky and barren, offering little cover, but it was high enough to give them a vantage point. From here, they could see the scattered remnants of the raider convoy below. Several vehicles, some of them disabled, others still moving. Lena was trembling in her arms, her small body cold and exhausted from the ordeal. Kira knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Stay close," she whispered. "We're going to make it through this." But even as she said the words, Kira knew it wasn't just about escaping anymore. They couldn't keep running. The raiders were closing in, and they needed a way to end this, once and for all. Ethan had returned to their side after taking down the first raider vehicle, his breath coming in quick gasps as he joined them at the ridge. His face was bruised and dirty, but his eyes were sharp, filled with the same resolve Kira had seen in him from the very beginning. "We don't have much time," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "The rest of the raiders will be coming up this ridge soon. We need to make sure they don't get to us before we're ready." Kira nodded, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cold. "We can't keep running. We need to fight back." Ethan met her gaze, his expression hard. "I agree, but we need to be smart about it. I've rigged a few traps along the path they're most likely to take, but those will only delay them. We have to hit them where it hurts." Kira glanced down at Lena, whose wide eyes were filled with a mix of fear and exhaustion. She couldn't let her daughter see the depths of the danger they were in. "What do we do?" Ethan's eyes flicked over the ridge, calculating. "There's a narrow pass up ahead. If we can lure them there, we can make a stand. It's a bottleneck. They'll have nowhere to go but straight into our fire." Kira felt her stomach tighten. It was a risky plan, but it was the best they had. "Then let's make it happen." They didn't have much time to prepare. Kira helped Ethan set up what few weapons they had left, scrap metal, makeshift blasters, anything that could do some damage. They needed the raiders to follow them into the trap, and that meant making sure they couldn't just ambush them from a distance. The sun had dipped completely below the horizon, leaving only the faint light of distant explosions and the cold glow of the stars. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Kira's heart raced as she looked down at Lena, who was holding her mother's hand tightly. "I'm scared, Mama," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Kira leaned down, brushing her daughter's cheek. "I know, sweetie, but you're so strong. We'll make it through this. Promise?" Lena nodded, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Kira could see it in the way her small body trembled. She couldn't promise her daughter safety, but she could promise that she would do everything in her power to make sure they both survived. The sound of the raider vehicles grew louder, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Ethan's hand tightened on his weapon, his focus unwavering. Kira drew her blade, the cold metal reassuring in her grip. She didn't have much, but she had her skills, and that would have to be enough. As the raiders emerged into the narrow pass, Kira's pulse quickened. There were at least a dozen of them, spread out in their armored vehicles. They hadn't anticipated Kira and Ethan making a stand here, and that gave them the advantage. But that wouldn't last long. Ethan's voice was calm as he spoke into the comms device they had found in the wreckage of one of the raider vehicles. "Get ready," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "On my mark." Kira's fingers tightened around her blade, her body poised and ready. The trap was set. The raiders were heading straight for it. "Now!" Ethan barked. The world exploded in motion. The first vehicle lurched forward, its heavy wheels kicking up dust. But as it rolled closer to the bottleneck, a series of explosive charges went off, one after the other. The earth trembled as the ground beneath the raiders' feet was torn apart by the blasts. The lead vehicle swerved, its driver panicking as the other raiders skidded to a halt. They were disoriented, caught off guard by the sudden onslaught. Kira didn't hesitate. She darted forward, using the chaos to her advantage. Her blade flashed as she cut down one raider who had attempted to flee the vehicle, her movements quick and precise. Behind her, Ethan opened fire, his shots precise as he took down another raider who had been trying to line up a shot on them. Lena stayed hidden behind the rocks, clutching the makeshift blaster Ethan had given her. She wasn't ready to fight yet, but Kira could feel her daughter's presence, her strength. They were all in this together. The raiders fought back with all their might, but they were disorganized. The blast had thrown them into chaos, and now they were scrambling to regroup. Kira pressed her advantage, moving with the fluidity of someone who had fought and survived a dozen battles just like this one. But just as it seemed they were gaining the upper hand, a new wave of raiders appeared from the other side of the ridge, their vehicles appearing like dark shadows against the light of the explosions. Kira's heart sank. It was a trap. She looked at Ethan, who was already calculating their next move. "We need to fall back," he said, his voice steady despite the danger. "This isn't over yet." Kira's stomach churned. They couldn't run again. Not after everything they had fought for. And then, the unthinkable happened. Another explosion, a bigger one this time. The ground shook again, and from the smoke and dust, a new figure emerged. One that made the raiders stop in their tracks. It was a ship, massive and imposing, hovering above the desert like a dark sentinel. The roar of its engines drowned out the sounds of the battle, and Kira's breath caught in her throat as the ship's cargo bay doors opened, releasing a squad of soldiers, more than Kira had ever seen. Ethan's eyes widened, but his voice was steady. "We've got reinforcements." And for the first time in days, Kira allowed herself to hope. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.